idea that morality is based on a social contract is very prominent in modern times, but the idea has been around since the origins of Western philosophy. In his famous dialogue, The Republic, Plato explores the concept of justice in great detail. Towards the beginning of that dialogue, one character named Thrasymachus proposes a shocking outlook on the nature of morality and justice, declaring that justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. Upon cross-examination, what it turns out that he means is really that the whole idea of justice is a made-up human concept. The difference between the just and the unjust, in other words, has no basis in reality itself. The distinction that does have a basis in reality is actually that between the weak and the strong. The strong oppress the weak and take from them what they want, and the weak have no choice but to put up with it. Contrary to what Plato, Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas would all later argue, Thrasymachus asserts that the tyrant is the one who lives the best and the happiest of lives. Justice, on Thrasymachus's view, is nothing more than a concept invented by the weak. Because they have no other recourse, they try to convince themselves that their oppressors are morally bad or unjust. In fact, however, Thrasymachus asserts that the weak have done nothing more than to engage in an exercise of self-pitying and moralistic name-calling. They call the strong unjust, and they call themselves just, though deep down they know that they would do exactly the same if somehow they came into a position of power. Thrasymachus primarily makes his argument against Socrates, who's charged with defending justice or the superiority of living a just life. Initially, though, Socrates is not able to refute Thrasymachus's harsh and shocking view of the world. That view is taken up by two brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, once Thrasymachus has exited the conversation. In his reformulation of Thrasymachus's argument, we observe one of the earliest arguments for the claim that morality is based upon a kind of social contract. But rather than praising tyranny as Thrasymachus had, Glaucon surmises that justice is nothing more than the result of a compromise that we make with those around us. Although everyone's preference would be to commit injustice with impunity and to be immune to the injustice of others, we settle to leave others in peace on the condition that everyone else does the same. According to this argument, Thrasymachus was still correct to suggest that justice has no inherent value, though he may not have fully appreciated its instrumental value for the majority, who are ill-equipped to become the tyrants that he admired so much. Glaucon's concise statement of this argument is an amazing foreshadowing of the essential teaching of social contract theory that would emerge almost 2 millennia later in the thought of Thomas Hobbes at the dawn of the modern period of philosophy. In his master work, Leviathan, Hobbes makes explicit the materialist and emphatically self-interested doctrine of human nature that was implicit in the worldview expressed by Thrasymachus. Human life, for Hobbes, has no inherent purpose or value, and from this it follows that there can be no natural basis of morality other than the physical laws that propel us to pursue our material self-interest. This is why Hobbes described what he calls the state of nature in such bleak terms, for this is the condition that he imagines that exists before the creation of a civil society that punishes injustice. Given the selfishness of human nature, we can have no assurance in the state of nature that those around us will not kill us, enslave our families, or steal our possessions. Because of this, we have every right, Hobbes insists, to kill, enslave, or steal from others as a preemptive measure. The problem, of course, is that they have the same right vis-a-vis us. and so the state of nature necessarily becomes a state of war, a war of every man against every man, and leads to a situation in which life is, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The human condition for Hobbes is essentially one of conflict, and Hobbes is aware how tempting it would be to suggest that human beings can overcome this state of conflict simply by agreeing to get along. Given the fundamental selfishness of human nature, however, such an agreement is inherently impossible. Granted, human life would improve dramatically if people just agreed not to harm each other, especially since the greatest cause of anxiety in the state of nature is the constant need to have our guard up. Yet Hobbes insists that the moment such an agreement is made and our guards go down, the same selfishness that moved us to seek peace will also move us to violate that peace. In short, we simply cannot trust each other, since, as he says, nothing is more easily broken than a man's word. Hobbes's solution to this problem is that people in the state of nature, rather than agreeing to get along with one another, agree to transfer all the power and authority they naturally possess to a third party. Since we cannot trust each other to honor any agreement among ourselves, we instead choose to empower this third party to enforce the agreement for us. Hobbes calls this third party the sovereign, and he insists that it must be all-powerful over human beings and that its authority must be absolute. Only after the creation of the sovereign, Hobbes insists, can human beings ultimately escape the state of nature and live in relative peace. We remain as self-interested as ever, but we now have the confidence that the sovereign, through the threat of inflicting terrible punishments, will make it in everyone's self-interest to respect the terms of the social contract. Hobbes's teaching is very straightforward. Justice only comes into existence upon the creation of the sovereign. And once the sovereign is created, justice is defined as nothing other than obedience to the sovereign. Even though he speaks on occasion about the law of nature, therefore, Hobbes comes down squarely on the side of the Platonic character of Thrasymachus when it comes to the fundamental questions of morality. Just like Thrasymachus had said in the Republic, justice is an invention of the weak. Just like Thrasymachus said, what it means to be a just person is simply to obey those in power. There is no natural law in the sense that Thomas Aquinas used the term, referring to a higher standard of right and wrong to which the law of the state is subject. And thus, for Hobbes, as with Thrasymachus, the very idea of an unjust law is nonsensical. For Hobbes, then, justice truly is the advantage of the stronger, only with the added teaching that obedience to him that is strongest, the sovereign, is also the advantage of everyone else. From the perspective of Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory, Hobbes is every bit as much of an immoralist as Thrasymachus. Some philosophers have argued that it is possible to anchor morality in a social contract while avoiding Hobbes's extreme solution of creating an all-powerful political sovereign. This is essentially the argument of 20th century philosopher David Gautier in his famous book Morals by Agreement. Gautier agrees with Hobbes's doctrine of human nature as fundamentally selfish, and so also with the corresponding proposition that moral rules cannot have any legitimate claim to our observance unless that observance ultimately serves our selfish purposes. Nevertheless, Gautier thinks that he can show that we have overriding selfish reasons to be moral even in the absence of Hobbes's sovereign. To illustrate, he uses the well-known and fascinating thought experiment of the prisoner's dilemma. According to the prisoner's dilemma, two criminal co-conspirators are apprehended by the police and asked to confess to their crimes, of which they are both guilty. Placed in separate rooms, they are told that, if they both confess, they will each serve 5 years in prison. If only one confesses and the other does not, however, the confessor will serve 10 years in prison, and the non-confessor will only serve 1 year. If, finally, neither of them confess to their crimes, they will both serve only 2 years each. Now, what would a rational person, Gautier asks, solely attempting to maximize his self-interest, do? In a broad sense, the prisoner's dilemma illustrates precisely why Hobbes believed it was impossible to escape the state of nature simply on the basis of an agreement. Although it would seem rational for neither criminal to confess, so that each serves only 2 years, the moment that agreement is made between them, it becomes rational for each of them to break the agreement and serve only 1 year. This means, though, that if both of them are thinking rationally in terms of how to maximize their self-interests, they will always choose not to cooperate with one another, and each will inevitably end up serving 5 years. Add to this the danger of serving 10 years if one agrees to confess and is double-crossed, and it appears that it would never be rational to cooperate for mutual advantage when self-interest is the overriding goal of everyone involved in the would-be agreement. If my partner dishonors our agreement, it would be better for me if I dishonor it as well, since I will then serve 5 years instead of 10. If my partner honors the agreement, it will still be better for me if I dishonor it, since I will then serve 1 year instead of 2. This again is precisely why Hobbes argued that we cannot simply escape the state of nature merely on the basis of such an agreement. The moment we let down our guard, we subject ourselves to the exploitation of others, and once exploited, we have no one to blame but ourselves. Gautier, however, argues that the two prisoners, and by extension self-interested individuals living in a would-be moral community, are able to escape this dilemma by simply changing their way of thinking. Ironically, if my partner and I each cease to act on what will most effectively serve our self-interest will, paradoxically, much more effectively be served. Explained in terms of the prisoner's dilemma, each prisoner acts on what is best for the two of them considered as a pair, instead of what is best for himself as an individual. Once this new consideration is introduced, one sees that it's clearly better to honor the agreement, so that each person serves only a 2-year sentence, as opposed to the scenario in which each thought only of himself and both prisoners ended up serving 5-year sentences. Again, it is the ironic upshot of Gautier's argument that both prisoners' individual interests are better served by acting on what is best for them taken as a group, as opposed to what is best for them as individuals. And this is why Gautier thinks that he's solved the prisoner's dilemma by providing solid reasons to act morally and to transcend self-interest, and yet doing so by appealing to nothing other than what will ultimately serve one's self-interest in the long run. But on examination, we can see that Gautier has not solved the dilemma. To see this, one need only consider what is rational for a prisoner who's made such an agreement with his fellow prisoner, assuming a rationality defined strictly in self-interested terms. Let's say the agreement was made before they were arrested, when, in the presence of one another, they both easily agreed to do what is best for them as a pair. Once they are arrested, however, and assuming Hobbes and Gautier are right about the fundamental selfishness of human nature, each prisoner cannot help but revert back to his self-interested thinking. He thinks, I know that I promised to honor my word so that we as a pair will come out the best way possible, but why should I think as a pair now? Why not double-cross my partner and serve only 1 year? Even more urgently, moreover, how do I know that my partner will not double-cross me? Clearly, I must break the agreement, at least to avoid the awful possibility of serving 10 years. Gautier's argument, in fact, was famously criticized on just this point by his contemporary, philosopher Gene Hampton, who characterized his position as requiring us to convert our way of thinking from one of selfishness to one of morality, but still ultimately, and somewhat paradoxically, all for the sake of self-interest. As she explained, quote, when you are in a prisoner's dilemma and you know your partner will cooperate, the cooperative action for you is never as good as the non-cooperative, exploitative action. But the same thing is true in the production of an incremental collective good. Cooperating with others by converting with them so that the sovereign is created results in a gain. Life in a commonwealth is better than life in a state of war. But exploiting the others, that is, letting them convert but refraining from doing so yourself, is even better. Because the cost to you of converting is always greater, no matter how many others do so, than the benefit you receive from converting. So, no matter how many others convert, it's rational for each individual not to convert. End of quote. Gautier's failure to solve the prisoner's dilemma illustrates why morality just cannot be based on a self-interested adherence to a social contract. If such a contract is based solely on an agreement, there will always be times when breaking that agreement will be more rational than being faithful to it. But if we can only trust people to do what's in their self-interest, such agreements are pointless, because we can just as easily expect people to serve their self-interest in the absence of those agreements. Hence Hobbes's harsh admission that, quote, covenants without the sword are but words, and of no strength to secure a man at all. If a social contract basis for morality is to be taken seriously, then, it seems that it must be on strictly Hobbesian terms. But as we've seen, Hobbes's social contract theory has it that morality itself is something of a farce. There is, for Hobbes, in the end, only self-interest narrowly defined in materialistic and hedonistic terms. And there just is no morality other than the choices we ought to make in order to serve that self-interest most effectively. As we've already seen, this doctrine is tantamount in its most important respects to the immoralism of Thrasymachus. The Thomistic view of morality and justice, though, is a bright and compelling alternative to this harsh and bleak Hobbesian and Thrasymachian perspective. As we've seen, according to Thomas Aquinas, we have a compelling reason to live justly, not simply because of a cost-benefit analysis that tells us our interests will be better served in the long run, but because the virtue of justice perfects us as individuals. Our flourishing as individuals, in other words, necessarily involves, as part of the constitution of our human nature, that we promote the common good of the polis in which we live above our own individual interests. Of course, we must grant that, by a certain manner of speaking, looking at morality in this way may still be described as self-interested, since the virtue of justice is something primarily attributable to, and good for, individuals. But this is a radically different kind of self-interestedness than what Hobbes, Thrasymachus, or even David Gautier is talking about. On the view of Aquinas and Aristotle, the primary reason I should choose to help my neighbor in need, for example, is not because the law compels me to, not because he might help me one day when I'm in need, and not because it just makes me feel good. My primary reason is because doing so cultivates the virtue of justice in my soul, thus making me a more perfect, complete, and excellent human being. Virtuous actions, as Aristotle teaches, are quite simply the building blocks of a life well lived. In a word, happiness. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle takes up this very point, fully admitting that those who cultivate justice and the other virtues, in many ways are a kind of egoist, in the highest and best sense of the word, though. They are not the egoists we describe when we refer to the selfish and the greedy, but they are rather egoists in the sense that they choose what is best for themselves, namely virtue. As he explains, quote, "Those who use egoist as a term of opprobrium apply it to people who assign to themselves the larger share of material goods, honors, and bodily pleasures. For these are the objects which most people desire, and which they zealously pursue as being supremely good. And for this reason, too, they fight to get them. Those, therefore, who try to get more than their share of these things gratify their appetites, their emotions, and in general, the irrational part of their souls. And most people are of this kind. Hence, the pejorative use of the term is derived from the fact that the most common form of self-love is base. And those who are egoists in this sense are justly criticized. That most people usually apply the word egoist to persons who assign to themselves the large share of things of this sort is quite clear. If a man were always to devote his attention above all else to acting justly himself, to acting with self-control, or to fulfilling whatever other demands virtue makes upon him, and if in general he were always to try to secure for himself what is noble, no one would ever call him an egoist, and no one would find fault with him. However, it would seem that such a person is actually a truer egoist or self-lover. At any rate, he assigns what is supremely noble and good to himself. He gratifies the most sovereign part of himself, and he obeys it in everything. Consequently, he is an egoist or self-lover in the truest sense, who loves and gratifies the most sovereign element in him." End of quote. So in the end, Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle provide us with a vision of morality that gives us the greatest possible self-interested reason to live and act morally, namely the perfection of our souls. Only by upholding this lofty view of self-interest can one prevent one's moral theory from devolving into immoralism, as in the case of Hobbes, or incoherence, as in the case of David Gautier.